Okay, hi, I'm Paul Gibson, co-founder of Retake Our Democracy.
And I'm Roxanne Barber, the other co-founder of Retake Our Democracy. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, welcome. Today's Zoominar will focus on a constitutional amendment on the New Mexico state ballot November 3rd. The amendment would eliminate having elections for the Public Regulation Commission commissioners and have it be by appointment of the governor. And it would also reduce the number of commissioners from 5 to 3. So those are the two major pieces to the constitutional amendment. And today we have with us Noah Long, who is the Director of Western Region Climate and Clean Energy Program for the Natural Resources Defense Council. And Noah will be speaking on behalf of the amendment. We have Joe Maestas, former mayor of Española and former city councilor of Santa Fe, and currently running for a commissioner's seat on the Public Regulation Commission, and he will speak in opposition to the amendment. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are on stolen Tewa land, and we want to thank the Tewa people for being stewards of this land for centuries. In deference to people suggesting I keep this part short, I'll just mention that it's 29 days until the election. And if the last couple of weeks haven't given you the motivation to get out there and vote, and to get out there and do more than just vote, but to try and get others to vote, I just encourage you to go to Retake Our Democracy and hover over our elections menu. That's retakeourdemocracy.org, and do that. We've got 4 great strategies, including one get out the vote strategy that will only take you about 5 or 10 minutes and can have a significant impact. Lastly, I want to remind you that on Tuesday, December 1st, we will have Senator Peter Wirth and Speaker Brian Egolf for a post-election conversation. And the interesting thing there will be that they will know what their caucuses are at that point in time. The elections will be over, and they'll probably have a pretty good idea of what some of the governor's priorities will be for the legislative session, and that'll be the focus of the conversation. So you can sign up for that at retakeourdemocracy.org. Roxanne?
Yeah, I'm just going to do my usual spiel for any of you who aren't totally familiar with Zoom yet, and then tell you about our how we're going to structure the conversation tonight. This is really more of a debate. So we're going to time the answers to the questions, and each panelist, Noah and Joe, will get 3 minutes to answer the question. I'll give you a 30-minute warning, and then I'll hold up, that will look like this. And then I will hold up the time's up sign, and I'm also going to use my phone with the timer, so I hope that you can hear the little bell going off. So I want to tell the attendees that we do not use the chat for questions. We will take questions from attendees, but you need to use the Q&A function, and that you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the little icon for Q&A. And Paul and I will be asking questions until about 7:30, and then we'll spend the last half hour taking questions from attendees through the Q&A. And just a little tip, I want to suggest that you don't start putting in questions right away, only because I'm guessing a lot of your questions are going to get answered during the first hour. So if you can just hold off a little bit, that's great. Go ahead and use the chat to comment. You can send notes to panelists or to everyone, but just know that the panelists, especially since we only have 2 tonight, are really going to be focusing on questions and listening to the other person's responses. So they are not going to be able to answer your questions on the chat. Please use the Q&A for that. Also, just for those of you who are new, this is a webinar format on Zoom. It's not like a regular Zoom call. So you can see the hosts and the panelists and hear us. We cannot see you or hear you. So just to make that clear to you. And I think that's it. Oh, in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see you can click on speaker view or gallery view. And we recommend, if you want to see the panelists and hosts all at the same time, that you click on the gallery view. And that gives you an opportunity to see people, to see everyone at the same time. Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. Today, as you know, we're going to be talking about this constitutional amendment that is on the ballot, and early voting starts tomorrow. So we're just slipping this in under the wire. For those of you who are going to vote early, you can get some good information tonight and help you make a good decision about how to vote on that constitutional amendment. So this amendment is going to change how the PRC commissioners are selected. Right now, and for many years, they've been elected by the voters in New Mexico. The amendment will change that to commissioners being appointed by the governor. It will also reduce the number of commissioners from 5 to 3.
I think you can skip.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's just get started.
So I think that's probably enough said. I think all of you on here know a little bit about the amendment. Oh, also the 3 commissioners, no more than 2 can be of the same political party, and they would serve 6-year terms and be limited to 2 terms. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to start with, I'm going to ask each of you, Noah and Joe, to take just 1 minute to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and your background and why you are advocating for or against this amendment. So who do you want to start with?
Doesn't matter.
Who wants to go first?
How about Joe?
I'll go first. Thank you, Retake Our Democracy, for really putting on this voter education Zoominar. I am the Democratic nominee for the Public Regulation Commission District 3, and I stand in opposition to this constitutional amendment. If we look nationally, our national democracy and our institutions are under threat. Cabinet departments like Department of Justice and Department of Defense were once considered nonpartisan, no more. Our Supreme Court is being politicized. We've seen the Citizens United Supreme Court decision allow the flood of this out-of-state anonymous donors into our elections. And basically, we're seeing an erosion of our democracy to freely and fairly electing a representative government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And really, I think this amendment is kind of insulting to voters. It's essentially saying, you can't be trusted. Let us select your representatives on the Public Regulation Commission. So,
Okay.
So that's why I stand in opposition of it.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay, well, with these 1 minute things, we didn't get down to the 30-second warnings. You get the bonus of a 30-second warning. You're on.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. Again, my name is Noah Long. During my day jobs with the Natural Resources Defense Council, but I've also had the luck to grow up in northern New Mexico. And in the last 6 years, I've been on the Conservation Voters New Mexico board. Thrilled that we've endorsed Joe for this seat. And it's an unusual position to be debating somebody who you support their candidacy, but I'm thrilled to be able to support him, and I'm sure this is a rare disagreement among friends. I'm supporting this because, I think this is a good government measure. I think the current system really hasn't worked. And while I support the principles that Joe just mentioned, of course, I think the reality is for the last 22 years, which is when it became an elected commission, we've had just scandal after scandal, felon after felon, incompetence and corruption with the direct involvement of regulated entities. And I think we can do better. So I'm hoping we can discuss all of those points tonight.
Okay, well, you left 5 seconds on the table there, Noah.
Thanks, Noah.
Oh, it's my question now. Boy,
Yeah, it's your turn.
It's like mad multitask time. So the question is, what is the nature of the crisis that warrants such a significant change in our state constitution? The language surrounding this debate has, and not this one we're having right now, but in the newspaper and online, is based on a perception of a crisis within the PRC that would justify a radical shift in the constitutionally mandated body from election to appointment Many of the examples I've seen are from more than a decade ago, like how Jerome Block stole money from the PRC for his drug habit. What do you see as the crisis here that warrants this shift from election to appointment? And Noah, you're on 3 minutes.
Sure. So as I mentioned, we went from an appointed commission, which we had up until about 1998, to an elected commission about 20 years ago. And I think it just hasn't worked out. The reality is that the regulated community that has a constant incentive to pay attention to these races has paid attention to every single one, and they have an outsized influence in those races. It doesn't mean that they win every single time. We have some great folks like Joe that are gonna run and win and represent the people, but regulated entities have an outsized influence in these races. And most states don't do it this way. 39 states have appointed commissions. We're one of only 11, one of only 3 in the Western United States that have elected commissions. And I just challenge folks or encourage folks to look on their own time or tonight. Google the Arizona Corporation Commission, the Montana Public Service Commission, or the New Mexico PRC, and you will see years and years of corruption after corruption, scandal after scandal, not just Jerome Black, but 3 felons in the last 20 years. And this reform would replace those 5 politicians with 3 appointed folks. They have to go through a nominating process. And then the governor can select from that nominating process with tribal consultation that then has to be Senate confirmed. So I think that process will get us the experts that we need to serve in this critical time when we're facing the need for a real clean energy revolution. And the reality is that we'll move away from that possibility of direct corruption through these elected races, which I think the regulated entities have shown their ability to pay attention and to win these down ballot races that so few folks know about and pay attention to, unfortunately. I'll just mention a few examples. You know, we passed the renewable energy standard 15 years or so ago. The regulated entities were able to get the commission to effectively downscale that from a 20% standard that was supposed to apply by 2020. The average compliance in 2019, when we passed that new renewable energy standard update, was only half of that. Similarly, massive underinvestment in energy efficiency and some of the worst decisions on coal. The elected utility commission in New Mexico committed to coal till 2053 before the legislature moved to get coal off of our system. And in one famous instance, actually rejected a settlement that the utility was forced in that settlement to agree to a rate reduction. And they said, we don't want to buy in future commissions. We're going to allow the rates to continue to increase. So I think if you look at the actual facts of the performance of our commission, the fact that these are down ballot races that folks just often don't know about. I mean, ask 10 of your friends how many of them know who their PRC commissioner is or know if it's elected at all. And you'll find that most folks don't. But the folks who always pay attention are the regulated entities, and they've outspent and they've outgunned, and it's led to some terrible decisions over the last 20 years.
Okay, thank you very much. So the same question is now for you, Joe. And so do you see the crisis as being so severe that this is the only remedy?
No, I don't think that the crisis, that a crisis exists, and that the situation regarding the PRC warrants the ultimate is, and that's amending our state's constitution. I'm the great grandson of a constitutional delegate, and the challenges that the PRC faces today certainly can be remedied even without state legislation. You know, perhaps the crisis is the constant resorting to these piecemeal constitutional amendments to address concerns that more often than not are motivated by special interests. From 1951 to 2016, there's been almost 2,000 legislative proposals to amend our Constitution in this piecemeal fashion. Over 300 such amendments have gone to the voters, and just over 50% have passed. So, you know, we can't keep reacting this way to solve problems and get at the root causes instead of resorting to such an extreme measure. Another crisis I think that exists right now is the constant undermining of the Public Regulation Commission at the expense of implementing these landmark pieces of legislation like the Energy Transition Act that is charting our course towards a carbon-free energy future, like grid modernization and the electrification of transportation vehicles. we're seeing that the PRC is supposed to be a separate power, but we're seeing the legislature, more and more micromanage this through legislation without getting at the root causes of the issues facing the PRC. In fact, the legislature commissioned a study by the National Regulatory Research Institute under the auspices of the Legislative Council Services to do an assessment of the PRC. And some of those primary findings were that the PRC was not being funded adequately by the legislature. Compensation and pay was inadequate. There wasn't enough expertise within the PRC. None of those recommendations from that study in 2017 have been carried out. And to me, that's really part of the root causes of the situation at the PRC. We just saw in every piece of legislation, there's a fiscal impact report. And in the cases of the ETA and grid monetization and other key energy related legislation, they call for additional full-time equivalents at the PRC because the PRC is saddled with primarily implementing a lot of these pieces of legislation. We've seen the budget vetoed for these additional positions. Right now, the PRC is scrambling to find a new office location because they've been evicted from their current office location. And lastly, there's really an across-the-board lack of consumer advocacy. The Attorney General has that primary role. We need to improve that. And I think that is partly to blame for maybe the parochial nature of the way sitting commissioners function at the PRC.
Sorry, I had us muted and I had to unmute. Oh, here. Wait. Oh, stop.
We're gonna have a fight.
Sorry, we're struggling with being able to time this right and turn the phone on and off at the right time. So, okay. So the next question, and we're going to start with you again, Noah.
Sure.
How do you think that appointing the PRC commissioners is going to address the crisis that you talked about?
Sure. Well, let me just first say, I think it's good news that maybe the debaters are getting along better than the moderators. I agree with so much of what Joe just said. I think we absolutely do have to adequately fund our PRC staff, and we do need expertise there. And to me, getting qualified expert commissioners is the first step of that. And I think those qualified expert commissioners will be better trusted and better able to navigate that legislative process. But it's not a substitute for adequately funding this agency that has so much work to do. And I talked a little bit about, in response to the last question, just the history that's gotten us here, and the constitutional amendment in the late 90s that made this an elected agency that I think was a mistake. There's been legislation almost every year to try to undo that, as the legislature has seen all of this scandal and corruption unwind over the course of those years. And I think, we are now facing a time that is really unprecedented in utility regulation. We're facing a period where we have to do more than we've ever had to do in utility regulation to solve some critical problems that we face as a state and as a society. We have to rapidly decarbonize our utilities to get them out of fossil fuel generation. We have to move to renewable energy generation. We have to invest in energy efficiency, and particularly in New Mexico's many low-income households that can't afford energy and certainly can't afford more expensive energy over time. These are complicated problems. Just let me mention one more. Electric vehicles need to go onto the grid, which will significantly increase the load of the grid and the work that renewable energy needs to do. These are really complicated issues. They're interconnected issues, and they all are pocketbook issues. If done right, they can reduce the bills for New Mexicans at the same time that we develop our local economy and get carbon out of the atmosphere and pollution out of our lungs. But if done wrong, badly or not at all, we can be precipitating even more of this climate crisis. And we need folks that understand these issues. Other state commissions are dealing with these issues. Other regulatory bodies around the world are dealing with these issues, and we need experts right from the top. And as Joe said, also in the staff, we need to build up that capacity in the staff to do that. So, I think an appointed commission will lead that effort, and an appointed commission will have a better chance of building up that staff capacity and expertise. Right now, too many of the lead staff positions, the director level positions, are open. Those positions right now serve at the pleasure of the commission, and a lot of staff members candidly don't want those positions because they're worried that if the clique that rules the commission changes, they'll be out of a job. So we need to change that atmosphere. We need to build up the commission. We need to support the commission. They have a lot of work to do, and that's got to start from the top.
Thank you. All right, so kind of same question, Joe, but since you've already said you don't see a crisis, tell us how do you think, or what are the benefits or the risks of switching, sorry, this question is not exactly worded clearly, of switching to appointing, the risks or benefits, appointment by the governor?
Well, I don't see too many benefits to appointing commissioners. The risks that I see is that it takes power away from the people and consolidates it. And to me, that's this ballot question is a democratic means to an undemocratic end. And I think voters are smart enough to see through that. And this effort, again, does not get to the root causes regarding the operational problems within the PRC, as I mentioned earlier. And if you read the actual language of the ballot, it's deceptive. It doesn't mention all those changes that you outlined at the outset of this Zoominar forum. It doesn't mention that the PRC is going to go from elected to appointed. It doesn't mention that the terms are going to be extended from 4 to 6 years. It doesn't mention that it's going to be downsized from 5 to 3 members. It doesn't mention that the mechanism for removal of a commissioner for malfeasance is going to be changed from the Supreme Court to the legislature under an impeachment proceeding. So, and it also it strikes all the specific language with regard to the scope of regulation authority by the PRC that in the Constitution, and basically says their duties will be determined by the legislature. So in trying to further separate these powers and make them independent, this amendment is serving to really put them more under the thumb of the legislature and the control. And so, we all know how special interests have been very effective. Over the course of the last decades, we have a Swiss cheese tax code. We have a citizen legislature. There really is no way to insulate our legislature or the governor from special interests. However, if you look at PRC candidates like me, we have the option to be publicly financed, which I am. And so I'm, as a candidate, insulated from any undue influence. And if I'm elected, you can count on it that I'm going to be an independent decision maker that's going to make decisions on behalf of all of the New Mexicans. Now, in response to maybe the parochial or the infighting, as I mentioned before, the Attorney General has that primary role to represent and advocate for consumers in these PRC cases. If you want to intervene as an individual, you have to ask the AG permission. And so if we had greater consumer advocacy within the PRC and by the Attorney General, I think you wouldn't see commissioners maybe fighting, getting very territorial for issues that are germane to their own district. So I don't see the upside. I think there's more downside. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe. Now I've got the easy task of just asking a question while she sets up the timer. So the next question is, the PRC is constitutionally mandated body, as is the legislature. Senator Peter Wirth wrote in the Santa Fe New Mexican in September of 2020, and I quote, "For years, the PRC has been plagued by infighting and nonstop controversy, difficulties managing the agency ethically and efficiently, and flat out criminal behavior. Can't that same exact statement be said of the legislature, whether it's DUIs for Representative Youngblood and Martinez or Senator Phil Griego for fraud, bribery, and altering government documents? But no one has suggested an appointed legislature. Instead, an ethics commission has been established to weigh in on instances of abuse of power or corruption. Couldn't a similar structure be put in place to ensure the integrity of the PRC?" And we're going to start with Joe and then to Noah.
Thanks for that question, Paul. you know, look, if you look at the status quo right now, by constitutional amendment several years ago, minimum qualifications and these educational requirements were instituted. And what I've seen is with each and every successive election cycle, we're seeing the caliber and competence of commissioners improve. And in fact, we've seen commission candidates that have been under industry capture, really being heavily financed by political action committees and their dark money. The voters have recognized that and not voted for them. And so we can't sell voters short, you know, with this effort. Now, as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court currently can remove a commissioner for malfeasance, but there are other ways without a constitutional amendment or without state legislation where we can really tighten up the ethics and the conduct. You know, for one thing we can do is in past PRC commissions, they have instituted a protocol, an ethical protocol, you know, insulating the chief of staff from politics, really leveling the playing field among all commissioners, including the chair and others. And I think there's more we can do. For example, on day one, if I'm elected, I'll raise my hand and say, I give up my advice and consent in selecting division directors. And I know that's part of the reason why, as Noah mentioned, that some of these folks in these divisions working their way up will not pursue these division directors because they serve at the pleasure of the chief of staff with the advice and consent of the commissioners when it comes to selection. So I think there's a lot we can do here. There is a code of conduct that really could be tightened. I mean, I think any body like this that's quasi-judicial does have parameters that really restrict the way they conduct business. You have ex parte communication. You have the Office of General Counsel that reports directly to the Public Regulation Commission that advises them directly on doing the right thing, not communicating with certain parties in a case. So there are already a lot of checks and balances within the PRC, but there's more can be done. And lastly, I want to also strengthen the enforcement of the minimum qualifications and have candidates vetted at the outset of their campaign instead of when they file. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, we have the same question for you, Noah. 3 minutes.
Sure, thanks, and thanks, Joe. And again, I think we agree on a lot of the other possible reforms that could also improve the commission, but I'll still stand that that we have a problem here. And first of all, I note, Paul, you mentioned a couple of things that weren't mentioned in the ballot summary. I think that ballot summary comes from the legislative language that was passed by the legislature. It certainly didn't mention everything. It also didn't mention the implementation language that passed this year that will require this nominating commission. And I haven't worked in every commission in the country, but I've worked in a bunch of them. A lot of my colleagues at NRDC work in these commissions. And to my knowledge, this nominating commission will be the most extensive nominating process, the most rigorous nominating process in the country. So folks will have to apply to the nominating commission, bipartisan nominating commission. Folks will then have to be moved on to the governor from that nominating commission. The governor will select from that list, not just from any list like she does for he or she in the future does for virtually every other board and commission in the state. And then if the governor doesn't like that list, they'll have to ask for another list before ultimately moving to the Senate for final confirmation. So it's a really extensive process. And I think, again, one of the most, if not the most extensive in the country. And I'd also agree, you know, the ethics commissions is a super important reform. They should certainly be looking into the PRC, just like they should be looking into bad actions at the legislature and elsewhere. And lastly, I think in your question, you sort of said nobody's hinted that the legislature should be appointed. And I certainly agree with that. I mean, I think, you know, one of the points here is making sure that our votes really count and that we are able to vote in to get the policies that we need. The legislature is responsible for passing these super important policies of the state. It's not the PRG's job to second guess those policies, as they have done for the last 10 and 20 years. It's their job to implement those policies. And we've seen massive second guessing by the PRC, partly because I think they believe themselves to be an equal policy setting rather than primarily a quasi-judicial, as Joe said, body that's supposed to implement these standards. And this really levels the field up, increases the bar for how commissions will be nominated. I think a lot of our other commissions could actually use this kind of reform too, that would get more expert folks on their commissions rather than just being folks that can be political appointees from the governor. But imagine if we elected every board and commission, the EIB and the Game Commission, the Water Commission, the Stream Commission. Imagine your ballot and imagine having the voter education job that we would do. Yes, we'll have to hold our electeds accountable. Yes, we'll have to hold the governor accountable. But the job here is independence, it's expertise, it's ethics, and the election process has failed to, in all cases. Now, of course, we've had a few great ones. I know Joe's going to be a great one, but across the board, it's failed to get us the kind of candidates that we need.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to remind all of our attendees, he doesn't know how to turn my phone off, that we're not going to take questions via the chat. I mean, there's great conversation going on in the chat right now, but do not expect the panelists to be tracking that while they're trying to pay attention and answer questions. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and you'll find the Q&A icon down at the bottom of your screen. There's a toolbar down there. If you don't see it, hover your mouse down and down there and it should pop up.
Yeah, I would like to add, I don't know how anybody on that chat is even paying attention to the conversation. Man, it's furious.
Yeah, I hope you're all listening, even though it is an interesting conversation.
I have it scrolling and I just see it moving. People are definitely, I can't see what they're saying, but it looks like it's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question is that, often when we try to fix something, there are unintended consequences. So one of the things that we're hearing is that people are concerned about whether a 3-member commission could be truly geographically diverse, represent the racial diversity of the state, and that the policy process for our state is already too concentrated in Santa Fe. So Noah, can you please speak to how appointment versus election would address this issue?
Sure, and first I'll just jump in by saying, I think you're absolutely right. I think when they amended the Constitution 22 years ago, they didn't realize the unintended consequences, and we've seen some sour fruit from that, unfortunately. And I think we have to recognize that that system is broken and that it hasn't worked for New Mexico. We have a 5-district program or requirement for New Mexico. And you could say that those districts are gerrymandered, or at least not working very well for New Mexico. The Eastern New Mexico seat has been consistently an anti-clean energy, climate denial seat. The Northwestern seat has been pretty well captured very consistently by folks who are shilling for coal. That leaves 3 votes that if you want a majority for clean energy, you have to sweep. And we haven't always swept. We've gotten some great folks from the other 3 districts, but not consistently swept those to get the clean energy votes and the consumer votes that we need. So I guess I'll say also, I really, really think that this tribal representation issue is a tough one. And it's a tough issue that we should be paying attention to for every board and commission in the state. There ought to be tribal consultation requirements. There ought to be tribal representation requirements. The nominating commission here does have that kind of consultation process. And I think that's an improvement and a precedent that we should be looking to for boards and commissions, not just in New Mexico, but around the country. But the idea that you need 5 commissioners from every geography of the state, I think is a false one. We're the only commission that's elected by district in the entire country. The only Western states that have 5 commissioners are New Mexico, Arizona, Montana, also elected, and California, which has 40 million people and the 5th largest economy in the world, over 800 staffers at their utility commission. Much different deal. All of the other states, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, these are states that are 2 and 3 and 4 times the population of New Mexico. Very diverse populations with rural populations and tribal populations, and they have 3-member appointed commissions. Not to say that those commissions are always perfect, but having worked in all of them, I will say they were uniformly more expert. They understand the issues. You get commissioners who are qualified, who've spent a career on these issues and can address the issues and pay attention to it. In New Mexico, we've had too many commissioners that show up just for the day of the meeting, collect the $90,000 paycheck and return to their district. That's certainly not uniform, but it's happened too many times. And I'm actually gonna give up the next 30 seconds and let Joe talk longer if he wants. Go ahead, that's my answer.
All right.
Okay, so basically, same question for you, Joe.
Thank you for that question. Before I get into having a reflective diversity and geographical representation on the commission, I want to just mention one thing about the Ethics Commission. They're really earning their pay very early. I'm not sure if people know, but there's a political action committee out there by the name of the Committee to Protect New Mexico Consumers. And they are engaged in a campaign in support of the passage of this amendment. And they've spent $264,000 just on flyers alone, trying to convince voters to pass this amendment. And I expect there to be hundreds of thousands of dollars more in TV ads. Now, I am running as a Democrat. If you look at the platform of the Democratic Party, that is against some of the most primary principles about undue influence from this dark money, these out-of-state anonymous donors. And I think we ought to repudiate that and let's not fall for it. Let's be informed and make an informed decision for ourselves and our families. Now, with regard to having a reflective democracy, that's the backbone, that's the foundation of our democracy, is being able to see ourselves in our elected officials and having the ability to participate in free and fair elections. I support a new U.S. constitutional amendment to overturn the Citizens United decision that has just opened the floodgates in dark money. And I think as New Mexicans, you know, we don't need that. We don't need that in our state. And I would think, as I mentioned before, given the climate nationally about the erosion of our democracy and all our institutions, this is the wrong time to be taking this on. And so I'm pleading with voters out there, you know, look, at the end of the day, you're going to decide for yourself. And the opportunities to get objective information about this constitutional amendment are woefully inadequate. Article 19 of the Constitution only requires the Secretary of State to publish the amendments in the legal ads for 4 consecutive weeks leading up to the election. That's not enough. And we're certainly not going to believe a dark money PAC. And it's going to be difficult to gauge what this constitutional amendment means to us in our daily lives by reading a legal ad. So New Mexico, we can do better than this. We can do better than this. Thank you.
Good timing.
Okay, and there's the bell that I don't know how to turn off. It's not a professional show here, folks. Are there other challenges? This here is for Noah. Are there other challenges that have beset the PRC in trying to achieve its mandate? We've talked a little bit about some of them, but certainly the lack of funding, adequate funding to hire a full-time staff. And I think Joe had mentioned some problems there. Can you address that? And whether or not, how in any way does the appointment of a PRC commission have any impact on any of that?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So, I mean, first of all, I just want to emphasize, I think the biggest challenge, unfortunately, facing our commission is lack of expertise right from the top. You know, I mean, we've seen 2 different examples of how to handle complex problems in our country right now. We've seen the Trump administration that listens to their political advisors on how to handle a complex problem of a pandemic. We've seen the Michelle Lujan Grisham administration listen to experts and, you know, move through that process in a much different way. And I think one that's much more advantageous to New Mexicans. And here we have a whole set of very complicated problems in implementing the important policies passed by our elected representatives in the legislature. And the PRC has to confront those challenges. And if we don't have the expertise from the top, we're just not going to get the job done. But you asked about additional challenges, and we've talked about a little bit before. I think here you're going to find a lot of agreement between Joe and I. The staff needs to be adequately funded. They need to make sure that they have the number of people to take on these problems. The utilities that come to these commission proceedings, whether it's a rate case or a policy case, they can staff it with a dozen attorneys and experts. They can bring in folks from all over the country and do modeling. The commission doesn't have the expertise or the capacity to do their own independent analysis, their own independent modeling, and neither has the AG put in dollars to do that, or the expertise or resources to do that. Interveners sometimes do that. I work at an organization that intervenes in some of these proceedings. Some other environmental groups do the same, and I think that makes a big difference. But the staff themselves need the capacity to be able to do that. So as I said before, I think the lack of the failure, I should say, of the commission to fill many of their top expertise has a lot to do with the political infighting and the squabbling cliques that have developed on our commission. And I think if we have an expert commission, we're more likely to have a capacity to build up that staff expertise, to get staff leadership on these areas where we need it. And I also think we're going to have a commission and a set of commissioners that's going to be more credible in these big budgetary fights where the state and the governor have to set budget priorities. We need them to prioritize this clean energy revolution, and that means understanding these complex issues and having staff that understand these complex issues. So, and I think the other piece here is it's not just about money, it's not just about resources, it's about ethics and it's about independence. And I'll note that the nominating commission requirements require candidates that are independent from the utilities and haven't worked at the utilities for years. So I think that'll be another big improvement to the times of our commission.
Okay, so it's same question for you, Joe. What is your view of the challenges that are impeding the PRC?
Well, the challenge is, if we look at the trends and what's happening, is this constitutional amendment, as I alluded to earlier, by striking the specific language of the regulating authorities by the PRC and leaving it to the legislature, further reduces the separation of powers, and it would lend the PRC to more control, more micromanagement by the legislature. Changing the removal of a commissioner for malfeasance from Supreme Court removal to impeachment. I mean, impeachment, really? Is that really necessary? I mean, in light of this ethics commission, to me, I think that those are troubling. And I think that another issue that really compounds this issue even more is that you have special interests going in the front door and the back door during these legislative sessions, and they're fine with complete deregulation. And if they don't like the PRC being heavy-handed, they'll say, take it out of the PRC. We've seen the regulation of insurance companies be stripped from the PRC. We've seen the regulation of corporations be stripped from the PRC. Now, a lot of these intrastate transportation carriers that are being regulated by the PRC want deregulation. Certain intrastate telecom carriers want deregulation. I mean, what's going to stop that from happening? We have, I don't know how many tax exemptions in our tax code. And that is one of the underlying problems in our Swiss cheese tax code that gets in the way of reforming our tax code. That's because of the constant influence of special interests. So these trends are very troubling. And really more specific to appointees, we've seen appointees under this governor that have not been performing in the best manner. Some have been removed by the governor. So having appointed commissioners is not a panacea to address all of these issues that we spoke of. And We're not always going to have a Democratic governor who wants progressive, forward-thinking philosophies about clean energy and our transition to a carbon-free future. We may have a Republican governor that may turn all this around. Granted that I think the intent of the amendment is to protect some of these commissioners that would be appointed, but there's always that risk. So this is really too much power for any governor. And it's, again, it's not a cure-all for these issues that we've been discussing tonight.
Great, thank you. So that's sort of a good lead in to the next question.
I think a lot of us remember a year or so ago when the Governor Lujan Grisham, was at the Oil and Gas Association meeting and said to them, quote, "I work for you." She got a lot of flack for that. And we also know that she's received, you know, significant donations from Gas and Oil and from PNM, probably El Paso Electric too. So how can we be confident that her appointees to the PRC are going to work for the people of New Mexico, for the ratepayers, and not for the industries that are charged, that the PRC is charged with regulating? So currently, PRC commissioners are elected and they're prohibited from accepting funds from the industries that they regulate. So there's some level of insulation against industry influence, but that really doesn't exist for the governor. So I think we're asking Noah first, right? How do you respond to this concern, Noah?
Sure, and thanks, Roxanne. Look, when the PRC has recently made a couple of great decisions that I support, and I think it's worth dissecting them to think about how interests play out at the commission now and how they might play out under an appointed commission. So maybe the best of those decisions, in my opinion, recently was moving from the San Juan generating station to replacing it with an all renewables and storage set of energy resources. Fantastic decision by the commission. You listen to how the commissioners justified their decision-making. Certainly two, and I think three, if you parse their words, of those commissioners said that they supported that entirely, or at least in part, not because it was renewables, but because it wouldn't use the San Juan facility, so it left open the possibility of continuing to use that coal plant. So I think that's an example of exactly why, you know, we shouldn't rest on our laurels on a couple of good decisions. We've gotten some great ones, and we've had some great commissioners over the years. I know Joe's going to be a great commissioner, but influence is at the very heart of this process. The utilities and the regulated industries that are regulated by the Utility Commission, they know these races. They pay attention every single time. We sometimes forget about them because we're focused on the presidency, we're focused on the governor, we're focused on the legislative race, and they don't forget. So I think we need to remember that this process is already fraught with influence, direct influence, and direct corruption by the industry that's always ready to take that opportunity when they see it. So look, the governor shouldn't have said that. I don't support that comment. I think that was a terrible thing for her to have said. But I do support our governor. I think our governor has made some great choices. I think the governor has been a fantastic leader during this really horrible pandemic. She signed legislation that's doubled renewable energy content that we're receiving by 2020, and will double it again in a few years. She signed all sorts of positive legislation that I think we can support. And I think she would appoint, or I should say, she will select from the nominating commission an expert commission that we can support as well. So yes, there is still the possibility of money and political corruption in our process. This is not a panacea. I agree with Joe, but it removes the direct influence over commissioners from the political process. They will not be politicians. They will be independent experts. And yes, the legislature is still subject to that. We will still have our hard work to do. The governor is still subject to that. We will still have our hard work to do. I think we can hold them accountable. I think we've turned the state around in the last few years from the dark days of the Martinez administration. I think we can continue to do that, but we need leaders right from the top that understand these complicated issues.
Thank you. And Joe, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Well, you know, what's I think most troubling is that there's really no consensus among the legislative, executive, and the attorney general on what the PRC should be. I think everyone needs to kind of really come together and talk about, what is needed to make this agency the top regulatory agency in the country, regardless of it being elected or appointed. But the troubling fact is that the elected commission is not worthy of having an adequate budget. It's not worthy of having adequate office space or a budget to facilitate a move. These are troubling things. I mean, I think that if we're being applauded for the Energy Transition Act, and it's exciting. I'm excited about it. But if folks from the outside looking in were to kind of peel back the onion, they're going to see the fighting between the executive and the PRC, the kind of the caustic nature of the perception by the legislature with this elected PRC, and they're going to wonder, well, how can the state make these pieces of legislation, Energy Transition Act, grid modernization, how can they make it a reality to really properly and fully implement it? And so that really is troubling, because you know what? Whether the budget goes up or down, the complexities and the workload of regulating these industries is increasing. And so you can't have inadequate, inconsistent funding for an agency that's facing a more complex, ever-increasing workload in regulating these industries. And so, as an engineer, I mean, I think logically, and I'm wondering how we can come from this incredibly chaotic situation. I think the chaos surrounding the PRC, when you think about the vision of implementing the ETA, is eerily similar to the chaos we're seeing nationally leading up to this election. And so we need to wake up. We need to snap out of it and start talking like adults and leaders about how we can really, really establish a solid path to a carbon-free energy future. That's why I'm running. This is an exciting time in our state, but it's much too chaotic. And we need to come together right now, like right yesterday, to start talking about how to set the stage for making this the best agency it can be, and being a truly separate power. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
thanks.
so we've got one more question before, well, actually two very short questions. We're going to ask each of the panelists to take 1 minute and sort of summarize their position. And then the last question will be just asking them to where you can get more information about this. And I would say this is probably a good idea if you want to ask a question to get to the Q&A and get that question in there. We've got 18 questions, but.
Right, and so I just want to remind people that it's not a perfect process, but we're going to start at the top of the Q&A with the questions that were asked first, and we're going to work our way through. If we feel that the question has already been answered in the course of this discussion, then we're going to skip it. So don't feel left out. And then we're also going to ask Joe and Noah to scan the questions. We don't usually have time to get to all of them, so we're going to pick the ones that we think are most interesting or most important, and then we're going to ask Joe and Noah to choose what they are really eager to answer. So that'll start in just a couple minutes.
Okay, so again, we'll start with you, Joe. Well, how about if you summarize your position? You've got 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you again for hosting this informational forum. This constitutional amendment to me is undemocratic. It's deceptive in nature based on what it leaves out in the actual language in the ballot question. It'll do nothing really to remove politics from the commission. And I think having an appointed commission is more susceptible to industry capture. It really takes power away from the people. And I just can't support that. People are accustomed to accessibility and accountability of their elected representatives. It doesn't have the geographical representation that we've come to know in a reflective democracy. And this question does nothing to address the underlying issues plaguing the Public Regulation Commission's operations. So, in summary, I just urge folks to really be informed. Don't take my word for it. You've heard my position, but please be informed and think about what you're doing. Don't let anyone try and convince you that they want to save you from yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And Noah, you can go for an extra 5 seconds if you want. Go ahead.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Joe, for participating in this. This has been really a fun conversation. I'm sure the questions will be too. So we've had a sort of a 22-year bad dream with this form of commission when we went to an elected commission. We've seen felons and incompetence and corruption at every stage for the last 22 years. And we can no longer afford this kind of PRC. Look, 39 states already appoint their commissions, including every other state, I should say, that's leading on clean energy issues around the country. And all of the states that have 100% renewable energy requirements like New Mexico. Joe said we should come together and solve this together. I think we did that. That's what this bipartisan constitutional amendment that passed with huge majorities in both chambers is all about. It's not the end of the day, it's not a panacea, but it's a huge a step in the right direction. It'll be the most rigorous nominating commission in the country and the most rigorous nominating process in the country. And I think we'll be well on our way, as Joe says, to having the best commission in the country to solve these complicated problems.
Okay, well, thank you both. Noah, we'll give you the first shot to tell people where they can get more information on the pro amendment side.
Sure. Well, I was joking at the beginning of the debate about my room full of interns working on this. So I don't have huge amounts of online resources to point to folks, but I'd certainly be happy to have people reach out to me if they have any questions. There is a website up, Yes on One, that sort of just describes what it is. I'd encourage folks to read the language. The summary is the legislative summary that the legislature passed. The language itself is pretty simple. The nominating commission language was passed this past year, and I'm happy to get folks the bill number on that. I think all that's really important, and the system's pretty straightforward. The other thing I would encourage folks to do is Google these other commissions. I would particularly recommend Googling, the history of the New Mexico Commission. As I said, it's not just a single year, it's years and years of problems. Google the Arizona Commission, you see the same kind of antics. The Montana Commission, the same kinds of antics. So I think those are good ways for people to research these kinds of questions. And like I said, I'm always happy to talk to folks if they have specific questions.
Paul, and I do want to remind folks that, as I mentioned earlier, the Legislative Council Services, every time we have a constitutional amendment on the ballot, they write a publication about, ironically, the arguments for and against the constitutional amendments that'll be on the ballot. People can find this publication on the New Mexico Legislature's website under publications. So I urge people to look at that. It gives the kind of the background of the amendment and the arguments for and against.
Okay,
Thanks, Joe. I recommend that too.
Thank you both.
Joe, if you send me the link to that, I'll put that out in the blog on Wednesday.
Okay, or if either of you want to go to the chat and type any website or any other information in there, you can do that.
Or have one of your interns do it.
Yeah.
Joe's gonna have to lend me some interns.
Okay, so do you want to ask the first question?
All right. So if you want to, have you both opened the Q&A? I don't know if you
No, let me.
It's at the bottom of your screen, and then it'll pop up in a pop-up window, and you can move it over to the right if you want, because it usually pops up right in the middle of the screen on top of people's faces. Were you able to get it, Noah?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to start at the top, and like I said, if we feel that the question's already been answered during the course of the evening, we're probably going to skip it. But first one it was posted anonymously, and that is, why do you think the appointment of PRC members will stop the scandals? What if we have a shady governor who's appointing PRC members? And so that's open for either one of you who want to, or both of you, if you want to take a stab at that.
Well, I'll chime in because I think it will. I don't know, maybe Joe disagrees. At least it'll help. Look, there's no panacea and there's no perfect reform. We've seen scandals at all levels of government. But this is a rigorous nominating commission process. So you folks have to apply for this position. There's a bipartisan commission that'll evaluate those nominees, or sorry, those applicants, and then forward them on to the governor. That bipartisan commission is probably going to disagree on a lot of things, but it's very similar to the judicial nomination process that we have in our state. And I think if you look at our judges as a whole, certainly there have been some scandals, but the judicial nomination process, I think, has led to a better set of outcomes than our PRC election process in terms of this kind of scandal. And they also, there is a process for removing them for cause if there are problems. I think it'll actually be a simpler process than the one we have for removal now.
And Joe, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I contend, as I did before, that we have minimum qualifications. We have minimum continuing educational requirements for commissioners right now. I think if we put some teeth into those and vet these candidates at the outset of their campaigns, that'll go a long way in ensuring that we have qualified individuals, instead of a candidate at filing that affidavit saying, on my honor, I comply with all the minimum requirements. And there's a lot of other things. These organizations can create their own ethics framework. There's no need to intervene at every turn with state legislation. Excuse me. So anyway, I'm done.
Okay, so I think Paul wants to skip ahead and to a kind of a tough question, I think, for you, Noah.
And we'll move back up to the top, but a couple of people have indicated that they'd like this question asked. So Noah, you're listed as the treasurer of the Committee to Protect New Mexico Consumers, PAC. That has spent $264,000 in support of this amendment so far. The committee was challenged by the Ethics Commission and agreed to disclose how it was spending its money, but has adamantly refused to disclose the source of that six-figure funding. Why the secrecy about where the dark money is coming from, and will you disclose the source of that funding now? Will you confirm or deny any of it is coming from utilities? And that came from Christina Fisher.
Thanks, Paul. That question actually includes some incomplete or incorrect facts. I am the treasurer of a ballot committee. We haven't done that level of spending, and the spending that they're referring to that happened in August was done by a C4 organization, a separate organization. That organization did file a spending report with the Secretary of State, but C4s aren't required to. It's educational spending, it's not political spending, and it didn't have a position on the ballot initiative, and they're not required to disclose their donors.
Okay, so do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, here's a question. I'm not sure I understand it, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it to you guys because maybe you'll understand it. This is from Jeremy Smith, and Jeremy's on the State Central Committee of the Democratic Party. And he says, we all know what it means to not approve the judge that the commission and the governor wants to appoint. It would create a ballot crisis where the person on the ballot running against an incumbent and benefits the other party. Therefore, these recommendation committees tend to be symbolic. Do either of you want to?
I think that question may misunderstand the nominating process, and forgive me, Joe, I'll jump in, but you can jump in too. The way this process would work is the folks elected this time, including Joe, if it passes, they'll serve a 2-year term. The folks that were elected in 2018 will serve out their full term. And then in January 2023, the governor will appoint 3 folks to 3 shorter staggered terms. Following that, each new commissioner would be appointed for a 6-year term. And the point of that is that it would take a governor 8 full years to nominate the full commission. So unlike virtually every other commission in the state, where the governor can sweep the commission and nominate all of them, this staggered term would allow them to, for all future governors, it would take them a full 8 years to nominate them. They won't be placed on the ballot. They won't face incumbents, as the question implies. They'll all be nominated by the governor, but over this very long period of time.
If I could maybe add to that, my understanding is this nominating commission would put forth 3 recommended candidates, and the governor can choose from those.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned earlier, utility regulation is a very specialized field. And in order to have this supremely qualified appointee, they're going to have a history. What's going to be their affiliations with regulated entities that now they've been thrust into regulating? How are they going to manage their recusals if there are conflicts? What would be the extent of such recusals? Again, this is the other end of the spectrum with these specialized appointees that could have a history. They may be very qualified, but they're going to have a history of associations and relationships with those entities that they're going to be regulated. So, it's a double-edged sword with appointees. And again, I have to state again that we're not always going to have a Democratic governor that wants progressive renewable energy policies. We could have one that wants to bring us back to oil and gas and not really look to the future. So there's inherent risk to this process, this appointment process.
Can I just add a little response to that? I'll be brief. I mean, first of all, I agree independence is super important. I don't think independence is well enough secured in the current process. That's one of the reasons I'm opposed to the continued election of our commission. The independence requirement that's in the statute for the nominating process, I think is a solid one. And I think will be helpful in making sure that new commissioners are in fact independent. So I think folks should take a look at that and see how they feel about it. My sense is if you compare the boogeyman of some future governor with corrupt influence over the possibility of 8 years reappointing the commission, and you compare that to the reality we have now, where we have a really hard time getting clean energy votes through our commission, and for the past 10 years they've undermined our clean energy statutes. I think that boogeyman is in fact a boogeyman and not as scary as the reality we face now.
Okay.
All right, so we've got a question from Eduardo Santiago. He asks Joe, or he asked both of you. Joe brought up Citizens United at the start and then mentioned his acceptance of public financing, which not all candidates would do. Aren't those arguments basically in favor of the amendment, at least and until Citizens United is overturned?
Joe, you want to start on that one?
Yeah,
I can too, but go ahead.
One of the arguments of the folks that are in favor of this amendment is that elected commissioners are susceptible to the influence of special interests during the course of a campaign. And so that's why I made it a point to explicitly state that I'm not subject to these special interests because I am publicly financed. It's an option to me. But what I'd like to see is I'd like to see it be required. It should be required because, some of the most powerful industries are regulated by the PRC. There shouldn't be any privately financed candidates running for this office if it remains elected. And so by me stating that I'm publicly financed is just countering that argument that under the current scenario of elected commissioners, that they're susceptible to undue influence from special interests.
Can I jump in on that too? Is that all right? Yeah. So I agree, Joe. I applaud you for that, and I'm glad you're doing it. I wish every commissioner had done it and would do it, but unfortunately they don't all do it, and they won't all do it. And even with publicly financed committees, you can have special interest groups spend through dark money, and they do. And we've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars in these races, which previously were relatively low spend races. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in these races from utility interests, from regulated party interests. And that's a direct influence that's much less diffuse than any giving that they might do to the legislature or to the governor. Now, I would support public financing across the board. I think that's a great reform. And we should work on that, not just for the PRC, but for all elected positions in New Mexico. Let's work on that together. But I do think that removing these positions from this direct influence will reduce the influence of the regulated community on the PRC.
Okay, thank you. So before we keep picking, let me ask you both, Joe and Noah, if you have seen a question in here, I don't know if you had a chance to scan through that you'd really like to get answered. We have a little under 20 minutes left. So, we've got some time, but if not, then Paul and I will just go ahead and pick the next question. Want to keep doing that?
That's fine. I haven't been able to scan them all, so
Okay.
you all may have a better eye on them. But unless Joe, wasn't sure if that was a thumbs up you had one or a thumbs up you're okay with them choosing.
No, I'm okay with them choosing.
After watching the debate last week on national television, it's kind of refreshing to see you guys so polite and appreciative of each other.
Well, I'm sorry, Paul, but that was a pretty low bar.
Well, I can
Oh,
assure you
God.
that, if we could, I would love to take Joe out for a beer after this debate, but I think we'll probably both pass.
I have to take a rain check on that one, yeah. Okay, we're just scanning through here, trying to choose something that we don't think has been answered. So let me see, Elaine Chimino. No commission, whether elected or appointed, will have all of the expertise necessary to deal with all complex issues. That's why proper funding is so critical, so experts can be consulted. So where is the money going to come from, and what would the criteria be for the expertise needed?
I'm happy to take a crack at that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I agree with the premise of the question. I mean, I think that appointed commissioners are more likely to have more of that expertise. And I think while well-intentioned, the qualifications requirement the past a few years ago has not proven to universally lift the bar. I think we've had some great candidates like Joe and a couple others, but hasn't universally lifted that bar. So I do think it'll help a lot. I think we'll get much more qualified commissioners, and that's certainly what I've seen in litigating cases in some of these other states that are pursuing similar objectives, 100% clean energy. That said, as to the funding part of the question, customers pay for the commission for the most part. So there's a small portion of every utility bill that goes towards the operation of the utility commission. Most of that money is often given back to the general fund and not used to fund the commission. I think that's a problem. I think customers ought to be fully funding their commission to adequately have the staff expertise. And that's really where the expertise would come from, right? The 3 experts on the commission or the 5 experts on the commission aren't going to know everything. They have to rely on a well-staffed and well-resourced PRC staff, and they need to be fully funded. I think Joe and I agree on that. And I think if they could get all or even most of the money that customers are currently paying for that, it would go all the way. It would more than double their current funding.
You have anything to add, Joe?
Yes, thank you for the question, Elaine. You're exactly right. I mean, whether they're appointed or elected, any commissioner on day one is going to be a rookie, will not have any experience serving on that body. That's why there are subject matter experts in all the divisions that report to the chief of staff. That's why there's an office of general counsel that reports directly to the commissioners. That's why there are a cadre of administrative judges called hearing examiners that actually make the recommendations, completely insulated from ex parte communications. So, I mean, this notion that a non-subject matter expert or a non-attorney can't go in there and in a very short period of time grasp their role, I think it's selling just anyone short. I mean, I'm proud that I have a scientific background. I'm an engineer, I'm a problem solver, but a lot of the structure in the PRC is geared toward, again, non-subject matter experts and non-attorneys. We do need more expertise, not less. And I've said that over and over again. We need more engineers. We need more folks experienced in economic analysis. We need more experts in telecommunications to help the PRC get up to speed, because trust me, these regulated entities, I mean, they're at the top of their game, and the PRC needs to be up to the job.
Okay, thank you both. We've got a question here from Ginny Dwyer. And she says, it seems to me that a core point is to discuss, a key point to discuss is the role of the PRC. Is it to implement what the legislature decides, or is it maybe something more co-equal in terms of shaping policy? How would each panelist see that role and any tensions that arise? Very good question, Jenny.
Sure, I'm happy to take that, or you can go first, Joe.
All right. I think, Jenny, you're getting it. You're getting the whole crux of what's happening here. When we, at the inception of the PRC, the present day PRC, 1996, when we voted for that constitutional amendment to merge the State Corporation Commission with a Public Utility Commission, I mean, this was a huge organization that was facing a lot of duties in regulating all these industries. And we've gradually seen those industries being stripped away. I mentioned corporations, I've mentioned insurance. So now with this amendment, we've seen this amendment strike the specific language that scopes out the exact authority of the PRC, and basically saying that that authority will be determined by the legislature. So it's diminishing the co-equal status that you mentioned, and does not further separate these powers, but basically relegates the PRC into like a cabinet department within an executive administration, which is sad given still, despite the stripping of all these authorities, what the PRC faces. And so this is very troubling, very, very troubling. We haven't seen the last of, I think, this trend that the legislature really wants to continue tweaking and micromanaging what should be a separate power.
I think you're going to see it slightly differently, aren't you, Noah?
I do. And I think we read the Constitution differently. I mean, I agree that the Constitution sets out the existence of the PRC. But if you look at the Arizona Constitution compared to the New Mexico Constitution, the Arizona Constitution clearly delineates energy issues to the Arizona Corporations Commission, ACC. The Arizona legislature doesn't pass things like renewable energy standards or energy efficiency standards. They don't directly try to regulate programs that will affect customers or how long a coal will last. All of that is left to the Arizona Corporation Commission. I don't think that's worked out so well in Arizona. In most other states, including New Mexico, the Constitution delineates the existence of the Utility Commission or the Regulatory Commission, just like it delineates some other agencies. And the specific authorities, though, on how to regulate those are decided by the legislature. So Joe mentioned that there's been this stripping away of authorities from the PRC. That's true, but it's not as if that regulation has disappeared. They've gone over to other agencies that have more experience. So insurance has gone to the Insurance Commission. Corporations have gone, that corporate regulation that he mentioned has gone over to the Secretary of State. And the Utility Commission, or what's called the Utility Commission in most states, focuses on telecommunications, pipelines, transportation providers, and utilities. And that's a lot. I would argue if you try to give it way, way more than that, there's no way the staff are going to be able to handle that. And you're taking away, too much from the legislature. So yes, the legislature is responsible for setting policy, and the agency has a really important role in implementing that policy. Now, like all other agencies, that still means there's a lot of policy decisions, right? I mean, no bill is so specific on every issue that there aren't going to be policy calls, and the PRC is going to have to do that. But they're not a co-equal agency with the legislature. They exist in the Constitution, but they exist to implement the laws as passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. I think our Constitution is quite clear on that. This constitutional amendment wouldn't change that. It would just make it a more expert agency capable of actually doing a better job on that.
Okay, sure. Well, we have a question from our esteemed Senator Joseph Cervantes, and he is asking, do you believe that a commission of 3 as opposed to 5 will be more or less susceptible to backroom deals, to a 2-member quorum for meetings, and rolling poll voting outside of Open Meetings Act?
I'm happy to take that one. Joe, you want to, unless you want it first. Okay, so I think that a 3-member commission has a number of advantages for New Mexico. And as I mentioned, every other appointed commission in the West and mostly appointed commissions in the country are 3 members rather than 5. So, you know, I'd suggest that this has been tried in the laboratories of democracy and proved successful. Colorado has a 3-member commission, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, and many others. As to the susceptibility to influence, I don't think the number of the commissioners is the key issue. I think the key issue in terms of susceptibility of influence is the direct spending and campaigning on these races that are down ballot races that utilities and regulated industries pay attention to every single time and have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in, where groups like Retake and so many other citizens groups have a hard time distributing their resources and their human capital across so many important ballot initiatives and issues on the ballot and candidates on the ballot. I think that's the key issue. I think as to the quorum, I think there is a significant benefit actually. We've seen on the elected commission that we have, with 5 members, there's often a ruling clique of 3. That's a sort of roving clique. You see, we just got a new chairman. I think I support the new chairman, but I think that clique and that clicking behavior that can develop among a group of 5 is less workable in a group of 3. I think you have more likely working professional relationships in a group of 3. And that's what I've seen and experienced in my work in these commissions. Look, do we have to still monitor them and make sure that they're following the ethics rules, that they're following the ex-party rules? Absolutely, that'll still be important. But I think by removing the direct influence in these campaigns, we're going to remove a lot of the influence. I'm sure Senator Cervantes will give me an earful when I next see him at the legislature, but I think that this is an improvement in that regard.
Did you have anything to add, Joe?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Senator. And I know that you had a lot of trepidation about this when it came to the Senate floor, this amendment, or at least the Senate joint resolution that cleared the way for the amendment. But thanks for the question. I think everyone is susceptible to maybe not, I wouldn't say backroom deals, but influence. And anyone with any significant experience in regulation is going to have a background. They're going to, as I said before, they're going to have affiliations, past relationships. You can't expect these, they're only human. They can't just turn all that off when they rule on a certain case. And look, you know, downsizing it to 3, I mean, that's one of the first things that I learned when I was a baby counselor is I learned how to count. And instead of, you know, 3 having a majority and a 5-member, it's going to take 2. And the very thought of only 2 individuals without geographic representation controlling utility regulation throughout the entire state is, to me, it's a bit daunting and a little scary. And I don't buy the argument that, well, under an appointed scenario, voters do have a say, or citizens in this case have a say, because you elected those House members and those state senators, you elected that governor. At the end of the day, when those appointees take office, any voter is going to say, I had no say in that person taking that seat as a commissioner. And nothing is going to change that feeling on the part of voters that want to see a reflective democracy through a free and fair election.
So here's a real simple question for you, Noah. Can you repeat the website for more information? Maybe put it in.
I'll put it in the chat. It's yes on 1. I can't remember if the 1 is a number or written out. Let me check.
Okay, great. Well, while he's doing that, we're scanning for another question. Let me see. What about go up there? Okay, let's wait, go up. Here's a question from Roxanne Allen.
I just like her because she's Roxanne.
Oh yeah, because her name's Roxanne. No, yes, she's down in, I think, the Albuquerque area. What are the chances of amending the structure of the commission if flaws, the structure of the commission, if flaws become apparent. So I'm not sure if she means instead of appointing, maybe some other way of fixing it if there are problems. Not quite sure, but that was her question.
I guess I'll just say the commission and its specific responsibilities, this gets to the sort of structure of the commission that we were talking about earlier. The specific responsibilities of the commission, the statutes that the commission uses in regulating utilities and other entities are statutes. I mean, they can be changed at any time by the legislature. The legislature has amended those time and time again over the last any number of years. So I think there's always a chance for further reform. The reform of the commission, reform of the structure of the commission. There was a failed bill a couple of years ago that would have changed some of the structural elements, not the appointments, but other structural elements. So I think those things will continue to get debated. I think there's a chance that any of those will rise to the top again, whether or not this passes. But I think this amendment was a attempt at folks coming together and solving this. And like I said, it passed with huge bipartisan majorities in both chambers, and I think really demonstrates the concerns over not just a year or two, but over a couple of decades of the failed reform from the 90s.
Anything?
Yeah, I just want to add to that, or maybe not add, but give a different perspective in that I mentioned earlier that the legislature recognized the need for reform. And I think to their credit at that time in 2017, they said, let's have a respected objective organization like the National Regulatory Research Institute assess the PRC and make recommendations like better funding, like better pay for staff, like more technical expertise. None of those recommendations have been implemented. And all of a sudden, fast forward 3 years and we're going nuclear on the PRC, without even looking at those recommendations and implementing them. So why is that? I think voters and citizens need to ask why weren't those recommendations implemented? And I'm going to send you that report, Paul and Roxanne, and maybe if you can post it up, on your website. Again, it's that 2017 assessment, but it's very illuminating. They don't just jump to recommendations. They talk about, some of the issues. And I think it's very, and a lot of those still apply today. So I'll make sure and send you a copy of that assessment
Really appreciate it. Because I actually
really here, I will add, if that's okay. I agree. That's a great report. It's not the first. Think New Mexico did a report. There have been 3 or 4, I think one by the Regulatory Assistance Project, all over the last 20 years, all talking about the problems with our commission. I think a lot of those recommendations would be valuable additional changes. And I'll just note that I guess my only quibble with his response is calling this going nuclear. When 39 other commissioners or commissions around the country are already appointed, it's hard to say that reforming it in that direction is going nuclear. But I think that those additional changes, particularly the staffing and the resources, are things that we're going to have to address to take on these big challenges.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much out of time. I had one more question from David Barnaby, but we like to try and keep it at 7:59 here. I'll be very interested in seeing that report, Joe, because I've seen a pattern of not funding regulatory agencies in the state, and it's a big problem in all of the energy and environment departments.
Or we could ask the question and then tell them that they could email us the answer and you can put it in the blog. Or is that too complicated?
I don't know. For me, complicated.
All right. Maybe we'll follow up just to let David Barnaby know, and then Paul can answer a couple of the questions that didn't get answered tonight when he blogs about this again. And speaking of the blog, for those of you who aren't that familiar with Retake Our Democracy, it's retakeourdemocracy.org. And you can subscribe to the blog there if you want to get that regularly in your email box.
And I want to thank Joe and Noah for a very dignified and polite debate. And we'll be back on December 1st with Senator Worth and Speaker Egolf, and I expect they'll be as convivial as the two of you have been. And so to everybody else out there, stay engaged. This election folks. We've got a lot going on, and it's less than a month away. In fact, a month
Well.
from tomorrow night, we'll all be just like,
Biting nails
4
and-
weeks from tomorrow night. So,
But of course, we're all going to vote before then.
right. But anyway, so please go to retakeourdemocracy.org, go to the elections strategy and get involved. And thank you all, you chatters. I can't wait to through all of that, because it was about the most animated I've ever seen, but there's no way I could keep up with it.
Well, and somebody just said she tried to save the chat, but she couldn't. But you don't need to do that. We are going to save the chat. And if you're interested, are we going to send it out to everybody who was who registered for the call?
Sure, yes. Everyone who
And you
registered.
can either dump it in the trash or go through it.
Yeah, no, we have an automatic one day after the Zoom where we send out the recording and send out and now that we'll send out the chat. And then we also send it to the people who registered but didn't wind up attending. And so I think we hit about 140 at one point, but we had almost 200 registered. So we'll be getting to those folks as well. So again, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your
Thank you,
evening.
Joe. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you, Roxanne. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Joe. And thanks to everybody for participating. It's just a joy to see this engagement with our state and our democracy. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.